guys, I am Dr. Kim Sage. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm so glad you're here. Today's video is all about self-gaslighting as it relates to being the child of narcissistic and or borderline parents. Now, we're going to go into it in just a minute, but if you're new here, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and also following me on TikTok for daily mental health content, really all about these topics. And this sort of topic today is going to be a sort of an extension of a piece of the work I've provided in my online courses on how to heal and deal with the trauma, which I believe it very much can be, of having borderline and or narcissistic parents. And it also connects to why my little course on remothering might also be helpful. And if you're also just brand new here, I also have a free course with a mini journal, a workbook, exercises, and a guided meditation on identifying childhood emotional abuse and neglect, because I want everyone to know what it looks like. And so we can all hopefully change these dynamics as we know more and we can do better. The reason why I want to talk about gaslighting the self as it relates to borderline and narcissistic parents is that at the core, for different reasons, if parents have these dynamics, they really can push us to a place where we doubt ourselves, where we do a lot of things I'm going to talk about that actually can keep us traumatized and keep us repeating unhealthy cycles and relationships. And so that is what we're going to explore. Now, really quickly, just a reminder that those who tend to have narcissism tend to lack empathy, tend to want to have control and power and manipulate, tend to have really poor self-awareness. There are many categories, right? This is sense of entitlement and arrogance, and often gaslighting is a part of their ability to attempt to manipulate and control children, right? Or the family system or the other partner. And so the reason why narcissists tend to gaslight is really because it's serving their greater good, right? Having you be not able to see things clearly, doubt your own reality, all of that serves their purpose. And so I do believe, and many people who have been victims of this type of gaslighting behavior will say it felt very intentional. Now we can, go back further to what causes narcissism in people and their own wounds, and all of that is super important and relevant. And that's actually in my course too, but you can also just research it here. I'm going to talk more about it too in terms of parenting and narcissism and where it comes from. But the root of this is that there is this attempt to be in control through using a gaslighting tactic. And as a child, when that happens to you again and again and again, or you watch it happening to your parent or the whole family dynamic, it starts to embed. The roots of it inside feel like that on the surface, things are not what they seem, that no matter what you thought you saw, you didn't see, right? You're told that it didn't happen that way, you're crazy, you're making that up. And especially as kids, we can start to really absorb that and take that on and believe that to be true. And I often see patients get really, like I've said before, foggy around childhood memories and parents who were this way, especially if they were more covert, they weren't, out and out direct abusive narcissists. That can be really challenging because it's like, well, I know in my body it didn't feel right, but they said it was okay. Or the memory says we had a good time, but my body doesn't feel that way. It's very confusing. The reason why I wanted to also share this gaslighting dynamic before we go into the self-gaslighting part, which is gaslighting ourselves, is that with borderline parents, I don't see it as, and I would say most people don't, as this attempt to manipulate and control. Although those who have borderline can be manipulative and engage in ways like that feel manipulative. They can lie, they can do things, but oftentimes it's to serve their greater good, which is having you not leave them, having you not abandon them. And so at any cost, they want to protect that. And so it's a different dynamic, but to me, the core of the gaslighting ourselves that goes with that sort of, I can't trust my reality and my body, is that oftentimes parents with borderline can really struggle with emotional and relational stability. And so it's, it's either good or it's bad. It's that splitting dynamic where when they love you so much. And when they're mad at you, you're the worst child ever or whatever. And so that chaotic relationship, I think, and our needs to protect the attachment at all costs, we have to have some connection, even if it means lacking safety sometimes. We're always trading those off, right? Our safety and our attachment, that is that source of safety, is also the source of fear in the classic disorganized attachment dynamic, which is very common in those who have borderline, is that the self-gaslighting we can take on as children sort of becomes this, I can't trust my body, because we've learned to sort of be in this really unstable environment from an attachment and relational perspective. And so all of that to me blends into this like part where we can gaslight ourselves, like, well, this parent with borderline wasn't that bad. They love me so much. Today they're watching my kids. They are going to leave me money when they're gone. They're going to help take me on a vacation. And so that can be really confusing, and you start doubting yourself, like, well, were they that bad? And you can feel a bit crazy. And so that is how I want to frame the self-gaslighting we're going to talk about next, as it relates to having both narcissistic and borderline parents. So, as I was saying, assuming you had a purely narcissistic parent and purely borderline, which can also, they can be in relationship with each other and choose each other. That is also somewhat common. So you could have one of each type of parent. But the core of it is you can't really trust in your body, in the relationship, that things are going to be and say and do what they are supposed to be, and that they're going to be generally and mostly consistently safe. We're not talking here about imperfect parenting where you screw up sometimes. We're talking about patterns of either neglect or a lack of engagement or over engagement, or patterns where it's just you just never knew what you were going to get, which often goes with borderline. And it can also go with narcissists, although I would argue there's a little more predictability there. You could kind of see the patterns because you kind of know what triggers them and where their buttons are, and it's a little bit harder with borderline sometimes, although you can know that. It can also vary because their mood and relationships and emotions vary. But all of that sort of not knowing and feeling truly safe in your body, I think, to me, is the source, no matter how the gaslighting plays out in our childhoods. And so what does self-gaslighting mean? It's basically taking that same dynamic where you don't know or see or trust that it is what it is, or you're told that it's not that way, and you turn it on yourself. The lens becomes, I can't trust myself. I doubt myself. I minimize my pain, my story, my wound. I rotate around others to keep it off of me, to really let myself honor and feel what I feel. Basically, I find any way I can to not really hold the truth in myself, that what I know is true, that this behavior, these things you called me, these names that you said, these parenting things you did to me were all true. And so we become adults who often are always doubting, was it that bad? Because people can live, like I've said before, and have these beautiful lives on the exterior, and parents who volunteered at everything, and they were the classroom parent, right? Or they did the dad's camping trip and be like, yeah, but they were there. But then when we go back and unpack it, we realize that there were all these narcissistic behaviors, right? Or ways of engaging, or borderline type patterns that, yes, some of those things were good, but when you peel back the layers in the surface, there was a price to pay, or there's a big, gaping wound inside of there. And so let's talk a little bit about what that looks like and how we can do that in some more examples. So what that might sound like is, yeah, and this can happen in therapy. I know it sounds bad. But it really wasn't that bad. Or I'm going to tell you a story and you're going to think this is really bad, but then it was really good at the end, and you'll understand why. Or I know my parent, I know when I say it out loud, they did all those things. I know it doesn't sound good, but you have to understand, they really struggled in their childhood too. They had terrible parents. And as I always say, yes, that is so true. And it doesn't mean it was okay what they did to you. We're not taking away from the fact that trauma can be generational, and these parenting practices can be so generationally wounding. But when you do that at the expense of honoring that, yes, it was bad for them and it was still not okay, that's what we're talking about here. That's where you're self-gaslighting, when you're throwing up all these reasons why, it's not what it seems, or I shouldn't be complaining. They bought me my first car. They paid for my wedding, whatever it is. It still doesn't make it okay. Or we say things like, I've done all this therapy. Why am I not over it by now? I don't understand that. And, of course, we can find better fits in therapy than not. But, many of us arrive in our therapist's office after, 20 something plus years of knowing these things to be true in our bodies and minds. You're not just going to unpack them in a handful of sessions or even in a year or so. I know that it's not always sustainable to be in therapy for a long time or forever, right? The idea is that we learn and grow, maybe come back in or out. But the truth is that many people do spend years, and it evolves what we're working on. And at the same time, if they're not able to do that or don't want to, many people focus on, books and podcasts and workshops and courses and journaling. So there's this evolutionary place to keep growing no matter where. You just can't expect that you healed that. You can learn to work through things, right? But you're not just going to have them always go away and never be triggered. It's just that hopefully over time, the volume goes way down on the triggers. And when it does go up, you are developing tools to manage it. And maybe if it's become a problem, it doesn't last for a month. It's a few hours or a day or two, right? That's the reality of it. You might say things like, I'm just sensitive. I'm sensitive. I overreact to everything. So I know it sounds this way. It's like that. That's the flavor of that. So how does this continue to hurt you? It hurts you because, number one, it often keeps you in the trauma bond with these parents because they have done this sort of behavior where you don't feel like you're entitled to your pain, or they've told you, you're being a sensitive crybaby, get over it. And then you take that torch and gaslight yourself. And so if you stay in the exact same relationship without changing it in some fashion, implementing boundaries, modifying the demands of the relationship, doing some work, you stay in the trauma bond, and the trauma bond will keep you self-gaslighting, because that is the only way to stay connected to the parents, is to continue deceiving yourself. Because if you finally see what's going on and face it in therapy or otherwise, the healthy part of you will demand that you do something about that. And that is going to require, which is often terrifying, setting a boundary, standing up to a parent, trying to change the dynamic. Worst case scenario, removing yourself from the relationship. Ideally, many steps before that. But that's going to be really scary and hard to do. And so you can stay in that self-gaslighting and therefore stay in the trauma bond. The next thing is it often keeps you in unhealthy relationships and patterns because you're just reenacting that trauma bond. Now you're doing it with your dating life or your partner or even your own children, right? And so you still don't trust that your experiences and your body and your story is really valid and true. And so you often find partners who just repeat the same cycle because that feels like home and it feels so familiar for you. The next few things it does is this self-gaslighting takes away your ability to change your life, as I was saying, because if you don't see it, you can't change it. It undermines your self-confidence and often makes you feel like an imposter because deep down inside, there's not integration inside about what happened to you and what the wounds are and what's happening now. It's like everything is fractured and split off. And so you have a hard time seeing yourself as whole and worthy. And even when you do well or succeed, you feel like, you gaslight yourself into saying, well, I just got lucky with that, or, things just happened to me. I don't really deserve this, even though you worked your butt off for it, those kinds of things. And the core of it is it can often keep you also really activated in mental health issues like anxiety, depression, OCD, certain trauma triggers. because you're often reenacting a lot of that mental and physical health issues, including chronic health issues, which we know are part of childhood trauma. All of that self-gaslighting keeps you kind of in that, that inner wounded child posture. And just really quickly, not to mention it, but it is true, the course I made on learning to remother yourself is that part of it is that we are the wounded child and we're also the internalized healed mother. And so how do you do that, right? How do you come to the child and try to help them heal? That's that reparenting dynamic. And so that can really be a problem too, because you're living out of that wounded child self, but you're in this adult body, and subconsciously you're repeating patterns and, like I'm saying, self-gaslighting and staying in these stuck and wounded patterns and cycles. So what can you do to help get out of this? The first thing I would really encourage you to do is to, at a minimum, get some books. I've got many on my website page. I have a whole page on resources on books. Read books about parents like this. Do try to figure out, does it fit this pattern of narcissism or borderline? Or, I struggle with the emotionally immature concept, because when I read through that, I feel like, I think it's incredibly helpful, don't get me wrong, like incredibly. And if that's all that you see it as, that's okay too. But it helps you understand, I think, if a parent has narcissism or borderline. First of all, we know that borderline actually does more and more show to have stronger genetic and biological links. And so if it's in the family system, the closer you are to the person who has it, the more likely it might be to be transmitted. It is not just a childhood trauma or trauma disorder. So that's one thing. You can also have early intervention. Understanding that borderline has this chaotic pattern for the child where you feel loved, that devalued and idealized, that splitting dynamic, I think it's really powerful, because what I found through posting all of these videos, especially on borderline and on narcissism, frankly, is that when people get it, oh my gosh, my parent has likely had this disorder, it takes the fault off of the child, because so much of the time, like we might say, yeah, that wasn't right, but it still feels like it's our fault. We can still feel such shame and wound and like we're bad inside at the core. And I believe that when you understand, it is narcissism. It's almost like it helps externalize it. It's like, okay, and it gives you the tools to know what is possible. Because if you have a truly narcissistic parent and they're not in therapy, which they typically are not, right? They typically have really low self-awareness. They're not going to change. And so once you accept that and know that, it gives you a pathway for knowing what your options are. What is a realistic path for having engagement or relationship or not with them? And the same is true for borderline, especially if they remain untreated. Though borderline, I keep saying, I know there's so much more conversation and diagnoses around it. Historically speaking, like many generations of us, the parents didn't think they had borderline. They would say, no, I don't. But when we look at the patterns and the behaviors, it explains so much. And then when you add in the fact that we all know now how impactful childhood trauma is to all of us, that 87% of us have at least one ACE score on the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. If we're saying that childhood trauma causes a lot of our issues, and we're saying disorders like narcissism and borderline can be triggered and set off through trauma, which we know for sure with borderline, and certainly with narcissistic parents and the childhood of a narcissist and the child's experience of that narcissist, as well as genetic factors, to me, it explains so much. And so that is why I keep talking about it, because I think that if you understand, for example, that your parent is an untreated narcissist or an untreated borderline, or they've tried treatment but they just can't stick to it, if you understand these disorders, it really does help you begin to understand what are ways to engage, what is possible, what is not, what can draw you into the trauma bond, what helps get you out of the trauma bond. And especially with borderline parents, where I say I think the trauma bond is the hardest to break, because for so many of those with borderline, they want to be in relationship, and there are parts and times where it can feel like they're mirroring you. It can feel like there's a relationship. And in those moments, I do think that exists for many people. It's just that tomorrow it might not exist. And for a child, that you can be so loved today and be such a bad child tomorrow, as hard as it is to hear that, if you struggle and you remain untreated and you don't learn the tools or ways to help heal relationships and yourself, a child internalizes that as being their fault, that there is something wrong with them, not that there's something wrong with my parent who has a hard time dealing with these disorders. And no matter what, whether you know what these are or not, even if you are an expert, it also doesn't mean that you have to stay in these relationships, especially if you try to change and they're not, and it hurts you more and more. That's a different really conversation on, going no contact or not, or how to set boundaries or not. Like I said, ideally you try to create some relationship, but many times that doesn't work either. And when you know what you're dealing with, I promise you it changes how you begin to accept and internalize not just what they're capable of or what they were or were not, even if they're not here anymore. It also gives you a roadmap and a guide for how to heal your life. Because I do believe there are specific imprints and certain struggles, and we know this is true with, whether or not you're raised by a parent who has a more narcissistic presentation versus a borderline one. And where your wounds are, and a roadmap helps you figure out where your trauma triggers are, where to work on your healing, where to focus your current relationship dynamics with yourself and others, self-compassion, right? You name it. To me, it does matter when we know, because when we do understand it, we have the ability to begin to know how to change it. And I just want to say that the way out of this, in addition to all of that, I got a bit sidetracked, is to focus on self-validation, right? To learn how to honor your own emotions, how to validate what you're feeling without bringing in that second guessing part. When you hear that voice saying, get over it, it didn't happen, you want to honor it did happen and it hurts, but I hear you, this part of me that doesn't want me to acknowledge it because it's scary and it hurts. So you hold that. You learn to identify what you're feeling and emotions. You learn to identify in your body when things don't match up, right? It's like when I'm gaslighting myself, oftentimes you might notice that I'm saying the words, for example, to my therapist, to my friend, it wasn't that bad, but somewhere in my body, something is happening. I'm shutting down. I'm feeling a sense of panic, maybe I'm feeling numb or foggy. This is a very common one I keep saying. And you want to learn how to work through those body triggers, through working on your nervous system, going back to this video on regulating your nervous system using polyvagal theory ideas, breathing, mindfulness, all the things that help you get integrated and connected to yourself. You want to work on your trauma triggers, understanding what do I do and say when I'm gaslighting myself that puts me into that fight or flight or that shutdown, and then learn the tools to get out of emotional flashbacks or states of that sort of dissociation where it's shut down, or where we're sort of activating and going, up into that fight or flight, overworking, overdoing, panicking, whatever it is, frantically trying to escape those feelings. Because the truth is that gaslighting that happened to you in childhood, it is still living in your body today. And you have just taken that torch and lit the torch inside yourself when you gaslight yourself. And you want to begin to learn how to say, wait a minute, this is not matching up. What I'm saying, what I'm doing, or I'm saying this, but I'm chronically sick all the time. Or I can't seem to get a handle on my well-being or my relationships. Maybe it's not going to fix that, because obviously it takes many steps to heal ourselves. But that one good, healthy step would be to begin to validate and acknowledge myself. Something that maybe I was too scared to do, wasn't safe to do, etc. in childhood. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you will consider coming back and joining me for more, and that you will take very good care of yourself today and stay safe and well. And I will see you next time. Bye, guys.